Alright, welcome back everyone. Hope you all had a very good new year and hope you've all managed to keep some of your New Year's resolutions by this point. In today's video, I wanted to do a Q&A. I recently reached 4,000 subscribers, so I figured that was a critical mass, enough to get a lot of good questions, and I was right because I've got some great questions to answer. I've broken the questions up into three broad categories. We've got questions about BookTube, questions about books and the arts in general, and some personal questions as well. I also have a glass of wine, well I have a bottle of wine, so we will see how cogently I can answer these questions, but in any case it should be interesting and also happy to carry on these conversations down in the comments. What made you want to start a YouTube channel and how do you find the motivation to keep it active? I've been watching YouTube for a long time and originally I used to watch a lot of music reviews and then I started to watch book reviews and I always had this little thought that it'd be kind of cool to do that, but I just didn't have the confidence. And it was when I finished my PhD and I was in between jobs. I was working in a hotel and I just thought it would be something to do, a hobby. And I also found that it encourages me to read a lot more. In fact, before BookTube, I didn't read that much at all, maybe one book a year, if even that really. And so the motivation for doing the channel just comes from the fact that I enjoy reading and I have to read something, otherwise I can't talk about anything on the channel. So that's pretty much why I started it and that's why I have the motivation to keep going. I also like discussing books with people and BookTube has allowed me to do that with way more people than I could ever do in real life. So that's another big bonus as well. Love hearing you talk about Wuthering Heights. Will you ever do another reader's guide? If so, what book will be next? Well, I'm glad you hear me talking about Wuthering Heights a lot because I feel like I do that a lot on this channel and probably will continue to do so. In terms of the reader's guides, I actually have and have had now for nearly a year or two the full set of scripts, or almost a full set of scripts, for a reader's guide series on Dracula. I just need to finesse the scripts a bit and then actually make the videos, and I've just not had the time to do that, but I do want to do it. The scripts are there. I probably need to read Dracula again now just to rejig the memory. But yeah, I would like to do another series like that soon. Hopefully I can just find the motivation and probably more importantly the time to get on with it. But it's really good to know that those reader's guides are appreciated, so thank you. Are your videos scripted or do you talk unscripted? It depends on the video. I mean, this is clearly unscripted, but there are some videos that I do like to get a script for, the reader's guides. But even then, I don't like to follow too much to the script. The only time where I religiously follow a script is when I do the summaries, just because I think in general, I do summaries a lot better if I'm just reading from a script. But actually, I think the Wuthering Heights script was partially scripted. So it just changes, and it depends how confident I'm feeling with the material. And sometimes, you know, it's just good to talk and go on. So it's nice to have a bit of flexibility. Use the script to give yourself a bit of a framework to go with, but then also if you've just got something that comes up, a little thought, you can just rant and go off on one. So that's how I script the videos. Will you continue the alphabet tag series? So the alphabet tag series, for those of you who don't know, it's kind of like this. It's a series of questions, although they're all centered around a letter, and it's actually an idea or a tag series that I got from a booktuber called Jim's Books and Stuff. He has a great YouTube channel, and yeah, I just stopped doing them because they did reasonably well with views, but not really well. So I just kind of stopped doing them. But I do actually have the full list of questions, so let me know in the comments if you're interested in me carrying on with the alphabet. I can definitely do that, so just let me know in the comments. And this question leads us nicely from what I just talked about, so would you recommend other booktubers? Well, I would definitely recommend Jim's Books and Stuff. I think he has really good tag videos. He comes up with very creative ideas that I really enjoy watching. I also really enjoy Just One Reader. I think he's a great booktuber. I also like The Authentic Observer. She doesn't really do books anymore. She has a great video on A Christmas Carol where she does some creative stuff with the, like with the set pieces and things and with the video itself, which I quite like. I clearly don't do that, I don't have the talent for it, but I really appreciate it when people do. I also like Steve Donahue. I think he has a great wit. He's always entertaining and he has lots of videos. So if you just want to really binge and get through a lot of stuff and listen to someone who is a very voracious reader, I would definitely recommend his channel. Okay, so now on to some general questions about books and the arts. What author do you identify with the most? I guess if it's author, that's quite tricky because I don't know all that much about authors' private lives unless I'm doing a reader's guide series or if I'm reading a lot of their books. And so maybe though I would say somewhere between Walt Whitman and D.H. Lawrence. I think the Walt Whitman side of it is probably just the way I view nature and the importance of it. And the D.H. Lawrence I think is more for personal background reasons. There's a lot that I can relate to in his works, and I think, I don't know, from what I've heard of him as a person, there are just some things for personal reasons that I'm not going to go into, but yeah, I have an affinity for him and his work. So I would say those two are the ones that come to mind, but in general, I would say no one really in like a really, really strong sense. Next question, which fictional character most inspired you? That's quite a tricky question. I feel like characters in general don't inspire me, at least not like morally or anything, or like I want to be like them. That's a tricky one. There are characters that I really enjoy. I enjoy Heathcliff. I think he's a fantastic, complex character. I enjoy Feathers from Knights of the Circus by Angela Carter. I think she's just this larger-than-life character. Any of Dickens' characters, they're just so vibrant, so colourful and memorable. I wish I could write characters like that. But that's all I can think of at the moment. Which fictional world would you like to experience? Well, when I was younger, I always wanted to experience Narnia. In fact, I used to play games all the time with brothers and sisters, especially when it was snowing. We'd like reenact bits from the BBC adaptation of the Chronicles of Narnia, which I still think are great and better than the films in their own way. The acting maybe isn't as good, the set pieces aren't as flashy, but it's just got a certain kind of heart and charm to it that it feels in spirit more like the original books than the kind of glitzy Hollywood films. So yeah, I would probably say Narnia. I feel like it's just a sort of world where, obviously, it has its problems, there's the White Witch and all that, but it's just one of those magical worlds that's always gripped me. Even though Lewis isn't the most detailed of world builders, there's just something so fascinating about the world that he creates all the same. Favourite story to read as a child? I would say there's two things there. So one is one that's quite personal, which is a story called The Last Polar Bear, which is a little book that I got when I was on my first aeroplane flight, and I was very scared of flying for like 5 minutes. I was scared until the plane took off, and then I really enjoyed it. But I had this book, and I was kind of reading it to sort of calm me down before that point, and I kept the book. I still have the book somewhere on my shelf, and it's a simple story. It's about a guy who goes to the Arctic or Antarctica with his dog. It's like they're going on a quest, and it just always stuck with me as a kid, and I read it quite a lot. Other than that, I would say obviously Chronicles of Narnia, although with that it was a lot more that BBC adaptation rather than the books themselves. I did read the books and have read the books and love the books, but it really was the adaptation there. I think probably I'm going to have to go with, for a series, the series of Unfortunate Events. I always loved that. I like how dark it is and how witty it is. It's just got an edge to it that I don't think, say, Harry Potter has, as much as I think that is also a good series. What is your favourite modern genre or subgenre? It used to be fantasy, but I've sort of gone off of fantasy lately. I don't know why that is. I think I prefer now maybe horror as a more modern genre. Never fails to impress when it's good. And I think what annoys me about a lot of contemporary fantasy is how obnoxiously epic modern fantasy has become, in a way that sometimes doesn't warrant how epic it is. Whereas horror books don't tend to do that. So yeah, I'm going to go with horror. Favourite literary genre? So for me, that's probably always been Gothic. Ever since I read literary fiction, I always thought the Gothic genre was my favourite, which makes sense. Horror and Gothic, they're definitely related things. But maybe as well, more recently, I've been getting into modernism. I read Ulysses a few times. I've been reading Virginia Woolf's books, D.H. Lawrence, currently reading some Nabokov, and I'm really enjoying modernism in a way that I never thought I would, because when I was much younger and was introduced to Virginia Woolf, as I've said, I didn't get on with it. And so I always assumed that modernism would just be this impenetrable, annoying mess to read. But actually I'm finding it to be some of the most interesting and engaging stuff, even if it can be difficult at times. What is your opinion on genres in general? Well, I'm not one of these people who's like, labels are terrible, because, if we don't have labels for things, how are we going to know, what the hell's happening? So we need labels to describe things. The only thing that I would say about genres is that sometimes they can be used in a pejorative way to demean the content without actually having any substantive criticism. So someone might say, "Ew, that's a fantasy novel," or "Ew, that's merely science fiction," or something like that. And in those cases, I think there's a bit of an issue with it. And there's an issue as well when there's a sense that just because something belongs to one of those genres, it can't be literary. And it's you can have literary works that are science fiction. We've got Brave New World, 1984. So I think that there is an issue with genres when they're used in that pejorative sense, but as a way of just talking about a particular style of book, it makes perfect sense, because there are commonalities between fantasy books, and it's useful to put them together and to talk about them in that way sometimes. Same with horror, same with romance, whatever it is. So, it's just a useful tool, and if that's how you see it, just as a useful tool of categorizing things, and you don't obsess about it, and you don't put value judgments on top of it, then I think you're probably going to be fine. What topics, themes do you love and hate to read about? Well, to be honest, there's not much I dislike to read about in books. I would say that maybe I don't read purely romantic novels all that often, but that's merely a preference thing. And you know, Jane Austen, a lot of her books feature romance quite heavily, and I adore them. So it's not something that's really a hard and fast rule, and there's nothing I think that, you know, if you said this book's about this, I would immediately just, you know, off the cuff not want to read it. I don't really feel like I have any blind spots. Maybe there is something, maybe I've just buried it so back into my mind that I don't know what it is. But yeah, I think in general I'm open to reading anything. I generally like books that deal with themes about nature. I like a good family drama. It's one of the reasons why I like Wuthering Heights so much, I think. Just these big, messy families. I just really enjoy those kinds of stories. They've always got a bit of a soap opera quality to them, which I quite like. I do like fantasy as much as, you know, my complaints earlier. I do like horror, all those things. Great. But yeah, I think a good family drama and usually themes about nature and society and how society interacts with people's natural urges. I really enjoy that kind of stuff. Are there mythical fantasy creatures that you enjoy reading about? Well, when I was younger, vampires were the main one, mainly because of you know, shows like Buffy. I always loved that show. And so they were always a good creature. Obviously, Vampire Chronicles as well. They're probably my favourite of the horror creatures. I don't get why people like zombies. They're just so boring. I mean, vampires might be boring now, but that's only because they've been overdone. Zombies have just always been so dull. They're just so stupid and they don't do anything. Werewolves I've always been a bit hit and miss about, because, you know, essentially if you're a werewolf, you know, you're just a person, and then once a month you get a bit hairy. It's never been that interesting to me. I do like a good ghost story. That's a new one though. When I read The Woman in Black by Susan Hill, this was a few years back now, I think. I loved that story, I thought it was great. I've not read many other ghost stories, but I do think that is a very good one. Have you read any Alexander Dumas? No, I haven't read any Alexander Dumas, but maybe I will someday. Why do you think horror doesn't get as much respect as other literary genres? So despite the thing that I said earlier about value judgments, I am going to say something in agreement with the idea that horror isn't respected. I'm not necessarily agreeing in the sense that I think it's a bad genre. Well, anyway, let's just get into it. So, what I think is that horror, and also I think to some extent fantasy, because of the tropes in the genre, I think it's a lot easier to write something that's kind of basic and simple. I think this is especially true in horror, because ultimately horror, or a big part of horror, can just be the thrill. You know, you can just read a scary story that's not all that deep, but it gets your heart pumping, it's scary. And so I think because it's easier to tell a story like that, those stories as a rule, they don't have as much depth, because at the end of the day, you're just writing to, you know, titillate the reader, to thrill them. You're not necessarily trying to engage with deep, meaningful themes. And so, in general, that's not going to make for, as, you know, a story with the same kind of longevity as something like, you know, War and Peace. And that's not to say that that is bad, that it's a terrible thing to do. Sometimes people just want some thrills. But I think that might be part of the reason. It's quite hard to write a literary work in that style, just because the norms around literary fiction do require you to do a little bit more work to engage, you know, like the intellect or whatever. So I think there is something to the idea why it might be looked down upon. The problem, of course, though, is that horror doesn't necessarily have to do that, and there are some great works of horror. I recently read Pet Sematary by Stephen King, and yeah, it's got the scary thrills. It's a Stephen King novel, but it's also got some really powerful passages and powerful characters, you know, talking about the loss of a child and how we deal with death in society. And, you know, it's a great book, and it's a horror book. So I think we have to be careful. Like, I think we can acknowledge that sometimes some genres, you know, that there might be some stuff that's not very good in that genre, and we might want to think about why that is. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the whole genre is worthless. You know, Dracula, another example. You know, it is a gothic novel, but it's horror. It's got vampires, monsters in. So, you know, there are good examples. So I think we have to be careful on that topic. But yeah, I think in general, I think that it's not good to disparage a genre. But I also think that some genres do lend themselves to, let's say, mediocre and sometimes bad texts. Another example of that might be something like romance, right? You can write a deep, meaningful romance like Romeo and Juliet, or you can just write some, you know, smutty thing that people like to hide behind their magazines or whatever. What do you think about the popularity of fan fiction? I personally hate it. Again, well, I think fan fiction is interesting, and maybe it'd be cool to do a video on that someday, because how broad do we understand what fan fiction is? Because is any adaptation of a book fan fiction, or do we mean something more specific? I think what I dislike about fan fiction, or the kind of fan fiction that I dislike, is, well, maybe two kinds. One is fan fiction that's merely gratification for the writer. You know, so this is an example where someone is just bending the logic and rules of the world so that they can, you know, shoehorn in something that they personally feel, you know, that turns them on. So, you know, a good example of this would be like Harry and Malfoy fanfic, where they're a couple. It's like, well, there's nothing really in the story that suggests that that would be the case. This is you doing a bit of wish fulfillment, which is fine, you know, for personal use. You can do whatever you want in your private life. However, I don't think that is the right way to approach someone else's work. Nevertheless, if you're doing something, so let's say, I mean, I can't think of anything off the top of my head here, but let's say that there's something in Harry Potter, maybe there's some characters, like Crabbe and Goyle, say, that they're like side characters who Harry just perceives as these two lummoxes, but also he doesn't really have that much engagement with them. Maybe they have some interesting things going on that Rowling doesn't focus on. You know, maybe you want to tell a story about these two neglected characters. I think in that case, you can do some quite interesting things. The other kind of fan fiction that I think is quite poor is, well, arguably what a lot of contemporary adaptations of TV shows are, which is, you know, just using the name and the basic components of a world and then telling your own story within that. I do think that's kind of cheap in the sense, especially if you're making money off of it. And I think that's another key thing here. You know, if you're just telling stories and using someone's world for your own private amusement, do whatever you want. I don't see why that matters. But when you're selling something to people, and when you're selling it as belonging to this world, as a lot of these adaptations do, I think you do have a responsibility to be somewhat respectful of the original world. It doesn't mean you have to be faithful to it in every sense, but it does mean that you can't just use the name and nothing else and just tell your own story within that. So yeah, I think in general, I think a lot of fan fiction is quite poor because a lot of it is gratification or just these terrible adaptations, but also it need not be. You know, I think, again, like what I said with horror or fantasy or whatever genre, there's always going to be good examples within that, even if there can be a lot of bad ones as well. In your opinion, which contemporary fiction authors will become great classics? Well, I would say that part of the problem here is I don't read all that much contemporary stuff, so tricky one. I would say Donna Tartt, I hope so, because I've read her first two books. I've got The Goldfinch, I've not read it yet, but I've been blown away by both the books that she wrote. Even The Little Friend, which is meant to be inferior, I think is a fantastic story with some of the most, you know, in fact, going back to that question about inspiring characters, the main character from The Little Friend, I just think she's a fascinating character. So I would like to say hopefully Donna Tartt. Maybe going back slightly, it's not fully contemporary because she's passed away, but Angela Carter, I really hope she becomes a classic writer. I mean, some people might say she already is, but I do think to be to be considered a classic author, maybe 100 years have to have gone by or something before you really get that status. Because what you want really is your popular time that you were alive to have gone, some time has passed, but people still think you're relevant. And I think Angela Carter is. I mean, if you read The Passion of New Eve, there's stuff about identity politics in that book where she could be describing the current political situation and the way that people treat each other in that discourse. I read that book with some friends and they all said the same thing. They were surprised that book, I think it was written in 1977 or 79, and all the stuff that she's touching on there is so relevant. And likewise, you know, characters like Feathers, they just have that eternal, powerful quality to them. So I think, hope and think she will be revered as a classic writer, or at least I hope so. Okay, this is a long question. So, hello. I remember asking about the Gorman Guest trilogy by Mervyn Peake. I'd love to hear what you think of it and if you enjoyed them. This trilogy moved me beyond words, and I recently heard it's going to be made into a series by Neil Gaiman. The books will always hold a special place in my heart. Well, thank you for that question. It's always good to hear when someone really, really enjoys a work, and Gorman Guest is one of my favourites. In fact, of the classic fantasy, you know, Lord of the Rings versus Gorman Guest, I think I prefer Gorman Guest. I didn't give up on Gorman Guest. I did give up on Lord of the Rings, but that might just be my personal preference there. But yeah, I do think that Gorman Guest is a fantastic series and one that's very underrated as well. And in fact, I would say it's probably one of the ones that if I do another reader's guide after Dracula, I might do Gorman Guest because there's a lot to say about that. I mean, obviously the third installment is less good, but what I like about it is actually the first two books go so well together anyway and tell a kind of complete story of Titus growing up, and, well, I won't spoil the story, but there is a complete narrative in the first 2 books, really. It ends with a kind of cliffhanger, I suppose, but it's the kind of cliffhanger that could just work as well. Because obviously Mervyn Peake, sadly, was ill and passed away before he could finish his Gorman Guest book. So it's good that we still have a kind of complete thing, even if obviously there were more books to come. As for the Neil Gaiman adaptation, well, my feelings towards a lot of these modern adaptations of things are usually quite lukewarm at best and downright hateful at worst. Nevertheless, I'm always willing to be surprised, and it is Neil Gaiman who, I believe, he must love Gorman Guest, otherwise he wouldn't be wanting to do a show, but also he's someone who works within these genres, so that gives me some kind of confidence that, depending on how much power he has with respect to running the show, it might actually turn out to be quite a good adaptation. So let's, fingers crossed, hope that that's the case, because I also think Gorman Guest would make a fantastic TV series, but who knows in this day and age of terrible adaptations, if it will. What is the best book you've ever read? Well, I could just say Wuthering Heights, and that's probably honest, but that's also just kind of boring. So other great books that I've read, I really like Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence. I'm going to be reading that again soon, I think, for the book club that I'm in. I also really enjoyed Ulysses when I read that. I would definitely read that again. The Waves by Virginia Woolf, Bleak House, David Copperfield, all of those. Maybe thinking about more fantasy things. The Wheel of Time, it has fallen out of favour a little bit with me lately, but I still think it's, as a whole thing, it is quite amazing, and Jordan's world building is very impressive, even if sometimes it's a bit repetitive. And I really enjoy as well The Lies of Locke Lamora. It's an example of a more modern fantasy series. I think that's probably one of the best I've read. I prefer it to Game of Thrones for sure. And also I shouldn't forget Clive Barker, in particular his book Magica, and his other book, which is slightly underrated in my opinion, a book called Sacrament. I think Clive Barker in general is a great writer. He's up there with Stephen King, but he's not often as well read, I think, by the general community. So I definitely recommend reading his books, and also just I think they're a nice blend of horror and fantasy as well. Do you agree that many people would benefit from reading more classics than self-help books? Well, there can be value to self-help books, and there can also not be value to them. I think my issue with self-help books is that a lot of them tend to approach problems too theoretically, so that they're really good to read because they make you think that you understand the theory behind whatever issue it is that you have. Say you have a temper, which I do, and I've read a couple of anger management books, and they've not worked. And I think part of the issue with that is, if you're just focusing on the theory of it, it's quite hard to actually put things in practice. And that's really what you need. You need kind of practical guidance for these things. And I just find that self-help books are less good at giving you that. That being said, I also think that novels on their own don't really do much either. I think one thing that a novel can do is it can teach you to empathize with people who are very different from you, which is one of the reasons why I think people really should read classics, because, it's probably one of the best kinds of diversity you can get, because you're engaging with someone who was alive 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. Like, that is, in my view, way more different than anyone that's really around today. So I think that's one thing that I do think that novels can give, that a self-help book really doesn't give. But I also think about books is that, and this is why I don't really like moralizing it in books, is because I think that ultimately, whether or not you get something of this kind out of a book, it really depends on you and how you approach it and how you read it. If you're just reading a book for entertainment, which is perfectly fine to do that, and I do that, then you may not get that kind of thing, because you're not reading the book for that kind of thing. Or if you're someone who's, I don't know, morally warped or whatever, and you read something like Wuthering Heights, maybe you think that Heathcliff shouldn't have been, shouldn't have been redeemed at the end, and that he should have always stayed vengeful and destroyed the entire family. And that's because you're already, that's just your moral stance to begin with. Or you can come to Wuthering Heights with a different moral outlook. Like, some people come to Wuthering Heights with the moral outlook of Heathcliff is irredeemable because of some of the things that he does. Other people are a bit more empathetic. So all of these interpretations are just coming from the person and their moral outlook. And so I think whether or not you actually get anything from classics or books in general really does depend on you and what you're willing to bring to it. Nevertheless, I do think that every book does give you the opportunity to engage in that way. But again, it's ultimately a question of, do you want to empathize? Do you want to understand? Or do you just want to impose your kind of worldview on the characters? Which you can do both. But I think, yeah, whatever it comes down to, it is ultimately up to you whether you want to get something out of a book or not. Have you travelled outside of books? I assume here by that you mean, have I just travelled? I'm not very well travelled. I'm kind of a homing pigeon. I've been to a few cities around the world, but not many. Generally, I just like to go to places where friends or family are, rather than see places. So I don't really have a bucket list of cities. I don't really care for that kind of thing, because I'd rather just see the people that I like. And if they all happen to be, in some nothing town in, Bradford or whatever, that's where I'm going to end up. So yeah, I don't really travel all that much. What are some of your favourite films? So I've got a couple off the top of my head, and maybe they're not the ones that ultimately are my favourites, but they're the ones that I can remember as standing out, so they must be somewhat favourite films. So firstly, we'll go with a kind of artsy one. I really like Ingmar Bergman's Persona. I think that's a fantastic film. It's a bizarre film, but also great, very well acted. Lots of interesting stuff about identity going on in that film. Lots of mysteries. You can definitely see where David Lynch gets a lot of his inspiration from. Outside of that, Psycho, the original Psycho, and also Psycho 2, which I actually think if we see Psycho as horror films, Psycho 2 might even be slightly better. So for those of you who don't know, Psycho 2 deals with Norman after he gets out of prison and he goes back, and there's kind of a mystery. So there's some murders going on, and it may or may not be true that Norman has lost his mind again, or it may be someone playing with him, and they build a big mystery around this. It's really well acted, it's really well scripted, fantastic sequel, and I would definitely recommend that film. I think it's great and very underrated. I also do love most of the 80s horror films, so like things like Nightmare on Elm Street, Chucky, those kinds of things. I really enjoy them. They're a guilty pleasure, but they're just fantastic films. Even when they're not good, they're always entertaining to me. So I really enjoy them. They're very Moorish. Favourite faithful adaptations of books? Well, I recently watched the BBC, I think, adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, which I thought was fantastic. Very faithful, almost to a fault, although I did see read an interesting article about the TV show that actually said it's not as faithful as you think, because a key aspect of Pride and Prejudice is that you primarily have Lizzie Bennet's perspective, and it's very important that you go along with her, and that so when she's prejudiced against Mr. Darcy, you're also prejudiced against Mr. Darcy. And it's only when she gets the revelation that the reader does. Whereas the actual adaptation focuses a little bit more on Mr. Darcy and actually stops you from connecting with Lizzie as early as you should, because you see him as a good person before she does. So it does actually create some interesting things. And also it's a good example for why doing a faithful adaptation still leaves room for interpretation, because people say that is a very faithful adaptation, and in one sense it is. It pretty much has every event that's in the book in the show, but it also does make little subtle choices that change your perspective of the film. You don't have to make these really big garish changes to things in order to be subtle and interesting with the way that you adapt something. But ultimately I do think that it is a faithful adaptation in terms of a lot of the aspects that it shares with the book. So that would be one example. I also read the Pickwick Papers, and I watched an adaptation of that. I think it was the very first one, and it was very impressive because the Pickwick Papers is quite long and episodic, and that makes some of it entertaining, but also can make it a bit tiresome, especially if you're trying to read it in one big chunk. I read it over a very long period, and that worked quite well. But obviously in a film, you can't really do that long episodic thing. You have to find a narrative and pull it all together. I think they did a fantastic job. The guy who acted for Mr. Pickwick, I just thought he was hilarious. He was a great actor. So that would be another adaptation that I really enjoy. I also think possibly, I don't know how faithful it is because I only watched the first episode, and it's certainly not faithful in some obvious ways, and that would be the recent adaptation of The Vampire Chronicles. Now yes, I'm going off just the first episode here, so feel free to tell me I'm completely off base with this one. However, although they did change the time period and they race swapped some of the characters, I actually think that in spirit they really still captured the essence of a lot of what Rice is doing with that book, at least with the first episode. So I didn't really have an issue with a lot of the changes that they made, and I felt like it was faithful in a sense. So that would be another one, but again, I haven't watched any more of it. I don't know why I haven't, because it's one of the few examples of an adaptation recently that I enjoy. Maybe it's just not having the time. But let me know in the comments what you think of that series. Is it worth carrying on with, or does it get worse, or what? And now for some more personal questions, some of which are kind of funny. So first of all, how old are you? Well, I am 29. Are you single? No, I've been with my partner for 9 years. Thank you. Why are you not on Instagram? Because I am not really one for technology, despite using YouTube a lot. And I do have Twitter, but I barely ever use it. I got it because I thought that I would use it for the channel, but I just don't have the patience for it. You know, I don't really like a lot of what I see on Twitter. And I don't know, I just don't have, I've always had this thing with Twitter, and I'm sure it would be the same with Instagram, where I just don't think my life or anything I have to say is interesting enough to say something, which is funny because I have this booktube channel. But I guess in this case I can sort of say a bit more, I can discuss a book in detail, but I don't know what I would say in like a little soundbite. I don't really have sound bites, or if I do, I don't have my phone on me. So yeah, I probably never will get social media much more broadly than I already do. Do you still live with your parents? Nope. What is your favourite city? Again, like I said before, I don't really care for travelling all that much. I also don't really care for cities that much. I am definitely a country bumpkin, mainly because I grew up in a dump of a city, putting it nicely, and so that's kind of my experience. And even when I go to the big cities, the big ooh blah blah blah, they just don't do much for me. Now there are a couple of exceptions. Surprisingly, London is one. I still wouldn't want to live there because it's expensive. There are people everywhere, and where are the trees? Those are my three main issues. Yes, it has parks, but the trees, it's all prim and clean. I want rough, rugged countryside. You want Wuthering Heights, not what's the park called? Thrushcross Grange. That's what I want. So London doesn't quite do it for me, but I always enjoy it when I visit it, and that's probably true of any big city that I've been to. I always enjoy them when I go to them. But I definitely want to leave at some point. I don't want to stay there. I want to be able to sleep and wake up to the sound of birds, not of honking horns or sirens because someone's been shot or something. That's how I see cities. So they're kind of nice things for a weekend break, less good for living. Have you ever thought about becoming a novelist yourself? I think you should give it a go. Well, actually, I have always enjoyed writing. In fact, I probably preferred writing before I started enjoying reading. I've been writing since I was like 5. So it's something that I've always had. I used to love writing stories about Medusa and the Hydra and other kind of mythical creatures. That was my first thing. And my grandmother really encouraged me to write. She downloaded this software called Storybook Weaver, where you could write a bit of text and then you could also like put a picture at the top, and it had like kind of like clip art essentially, and like frames and stuff, and you could put it all in and then write the story underneath. So I used to love doing that when I was younger. I actually wrote and self-published a book, which I won't give any more details about, but when I was a bit older, a teenager, and I kind of have abandoned that. I'm proud of the book, but it is what it is. And I'm currently actually writing as well. I've actually just finished a full first draft of a manuscript, but it is very long and needs to have a lot of chopping up into little pieces. So who knows, maybe one day I will be a novelist. That would be nice, but we will see what happens. Favourite football team? I don't watch football, so I don't have one. Have you been to Bronte Country in Haworth? No, but I would like to. In fact, I have had this thing for a while now where, because I've been reading a lot, and I started reading biographies a lot as well, and obviously in biographies sometimes they mention places and family homes of authors, or places where they wrote, or places where they like to go, whatever. And I do like the idea of going to kind of pilgrimages to these places. So one thing that I think I would like to do with traveling, which I haven't really had before, it's not so much that I want to travel necessarily, it's more like I have an association with this author or this work of art or something, and so I really only want to go to the place for that reason. Not just to see it for the sake of seeing it, but because, like with Jane Austen or something, I really like her work, therefore it would be interesting to go and see what's, somewhere where she lived, or likewise with the Brontes, which I really should do because my family home isn't all that far away from Bronte Country, so I really should do that, I just haven't got around to it. And the final question is, Happy New Year, what are your favourite hobbies outside of reading? Well, Happy New Year to you and to everyone else. In terms of hobbies, obviously writing is a big one. I also am trying to learn piano. I've been trying to learn piano now for several years, and I keep giving up, but I keep trying. So hopefully one day we'll get there with that. And I do philosophy, that's my job, but I also like to do it as a hobby, just reading, especially older texts, because I do a lot of contemporary philosophy stuff, which I enjoy, but for me, the contemporary stuff, that is what I would classify as my job, my work. I read it because that's what I'm doing, that's what will hopefully get me a permanent job one day. Fingers crossed. However, mainly what I prefer to do in terms of hobbies is reading classics, reading the older stuff, and just kind of building that foundation. Alright, that is it for all of your questions. Thank you for everyone that asked a question. I really had a lot of fun thinking about these answers and trying a completely unscripted video, which is a new thing for me. So hopefully this isn't complete babble and is quite entertaining. Let me know in the comments though, how would you answer some of these questions, or if you have anything that you'd like to say in response to anything I've said. Always happy to have those discussions with you in the comments. Otherwise, for those of you that have kept your New Year's resolutions, fingers crossed that you keep keeping them. For those of you that haven't, never mind. You can always break some more next year. I'm now going to go and finish this bottle of wine and edit this probably tomorrow or the day after. Take care everyone. Ta-ra.